In education, intellectual development is not enough. Education must be both intellectual and emotional. That comment comes from Erich Fromm, one of the most famous psychoanalysts of the 20th century. On a similar note, A.S. Neal, very famous and controversial educator, said this. Neal said, "I would rather see a school produce a healthy street cleaner than a neurotic scholar." This program, part 3 of my series of programs on the theme, What are the most important things we can learn, will focus on emotional education and what the great thinkers in philosophy and psychology, literature and religion have said about it. Among the questions I will be addressing in this program concerning emotional education are the following. First, how does one go about educating the emotions? Second, what can we all do to deal better with the difficulties of daily living? Third, what are the standards we can use to determine emotional growth? And fourth and last, the larger question, which is what standards can we use to judge mental health? And again, what have the famous thinkers said in response to these questions? With regard to educating the emotions, the Buddhists and many others have said that real education is a kind of therapy. And psychiatrist Alfred Adler has said that a good school is a school that promotes mental health. Why do we need to grow emotionally? Perhaps Henry David Thoreau provides some illumination here. In Walden, in one of the classic sentences from his masterpiece, Thoreau wrote this: "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." He also went on to comment that dis-ease is the rule of our terrestrial life. Dis-ease is the rule of our terrestrial life. What does growing emotionally involve? Well, I think it's fair to say that among the things emotional growth involves is reducing anxiety, becoming less nervous, dealing better with our stress level and bringing our stress level down, increasing one's tranquility, and dealing better with our fears, angers, and desires. So many of the great thinkers have said that our desires are insatiable, and that so often our desires cause us discomfort and indeed much unhappiness. Joseph Campbell put it this way. Professor Campbell said, "Desire and fear, these are the two emotions by which all life in the world is governed." What's the path to emotional growth? Socrates, Freud, so many others have commented that the essence of the path is knowing thyself. You might recall that those words, know thyself, were inscribed on a temple in ancient Greece. And of course, the important questions concerning knowing oneself are, what makes me anxious? What makes me tranquil? The Buddhists, I think, perhaps have one of the better responses to growing emotionally. The Buddhists claim that if we wish to be less anxious and more tranquil, it's very important that we engage in mood monitoring, which involves thinking about our thinking. What it means is that when we are thinking negative thoughts, we should realize that we are thinking negative thoughts and come up with some antidote to them. So that if we are angry or if we are frustrated, recognize that feeling early on and again try to come up with some kind of antidote. There are many versions of what self-improvement involves. And let me give you 2 contrasting versions of self-improvement. I think it's fair to say all of us are interested in self-improvement. In one version, there is an emphasis on more social status, more approval from other people, more expensive possessions, and perhaps more power over others. Many of the great thinkers, especially Adler and Nietzsche, have claimed that whether we realize it or not, we sometimes have a desire to exert power over others. This particular version of self-improvement that I've just enumerated emphasizes things and appearances as the way to self-improvement. Well, another version of self-improvement emphasizes the word less. And the idea of this self-improvement program is to work on worrying less, being less nervous, less angry, less lazy, less envious, and less gluttonous, which would involve more discipline in our eating habits. I think it's fair to say most of us could use more discipline in our eating habits. This latter version is one that puts the emphasis on the spiritual and the psychological, again in contrast to the first version I mentioned, which places emphasis on things and appearances. It's been said that self-improvement really involves self-mastery and self-conquest. And it is interesting that so many of the great religions and so many of the great philosophers and men and women of letters emphasize this idea of self-mastery and self-conquest and how important it is that all of us work on it. Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, and philosophers such as Confucius, Aristotle, Spinoza, especially place great emphasis on this idea of self-mastery. It is interesting that in the Quran, the holy book of Islam, it is said that the greatest jihad, the most important jihad or struggle, is the struggle against oneself. It's the struggle for self-conquest, for self-mastery, for conquering whatever is negative in us and cultivating what is positive in us. An interesting question, I think, is how much education in self-mastery does the typical school provide? Again, how much education in self-mastery does the typical school provide? Leo Buscaglia was a professor of education at the University of Southern California, and in general he gave our schools poor marks. He said that so often people leave our high schools with minds full of isolated, meaningless facts, but with little knowledge of themselves, with little knowledge of life. Hermann Hesse, Nobel Prize-winning writer, said that in me, and I'm quoting him now, in me school destroyed a great deal. And Einstein, in his autobiography, commented on his school days and claimed that for the most part his experiences were negative. And he talked about the traditional education machine. Those are his words. He claimed that so much of education was really propaganda and did not provide much illumination about living a better life. And Mark Twain, of course, in a humorous vein, said, "I never let my schooling interfere with my education." Self-improvement, of course, self-improvement also deals with getting better at dealing with adversity. We all experience difficulties, I think, virtually every day of our lives, and I think it's fair to say if we're going to get better at living, it's important that we get better at dealing with daily problems. Before I tell you what the great thinkers have said about this, let me engage in full disclosure. I don't claim at all to be an expert in dealing with life's difficulties. I, like I suspect many of you, strive every day to deal with them as best I can. But I will tell you that so many of the great thinkers I have read have provided important advice to me, advice which I try to follow, and usually when I succeed in following it, it does make my life better. The great thinkers have said that if we are going to get better at daily living, it's very important that we understand the nature of reality, that we understand the nature of life. And in this context, M. Scott Peck, very famous 20th century psychiatrist, indeed he's still alive, Peck begins his most famous book with these words: Life is difficult. Those are his words. Life is difficult. Mother Teresa has said that suffering will never be completely absent from our lives. And Shakespeare has Hamlet in perhaps the most well-known monologue in all of literature say the following. Hamlet, in the To Be or Not to Be monologue, speaks of, and I'm quoting him, the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. So the question becomes, how to reduce the suffering? What can we do to reduce our pain in dealing with the problems of life? Well, the Buddha, I think, provides important advice. Perhaps many of you know that the Buddha said that much of our pain is self-chosen, and that if we are going to get better at living, we had better realize this, and we had better be able to distinguish avoidable suffering from unavoidable suffering. In this connection, the famous German philosopher Schopenhauer said that we cause ourselves a lot of pain because so many of us attach so much importance to what other people think of us. Schopenhauer used the German word for obsessed. He said that most people are obsessed with what other people think of them, that most people are obsessed with getting other people's approval. And this is an avoidable source of suffering, that if we could learn to pay less attention to what other people think of us, we will all be infinitely more tranquil. In this context, let me briefly discuss what might be other kinds of avoidable suffering. But first, let me mention that, of course, there are kinds of suffering in life that are unavoidable. So let's start with the unavoidable suffering. I think it's fair to say that illness is an unavoidable cause of suffering. The death of a loved one, loss of a job, all of these things are going to cause people suffering no matter what their degree of mental health, no matter how good their state of mental health. But with regard to avoidable suffering, besides the one I've already mentioned, and that is seeking other people's approval, I think if I had a room full of psychiatrists here and I asked them to enumerate what might be the 5 leading causes of unhappiness in life, I have little doubt that almost all of them, if not all of them, would claim that one of the leading causes of unhappiness in life is unrealistic expectations. That so often we have unrealistic expectations about marriage, about children, or if one is single, one may have unrealistic expectations about how happy and how good it is to be single. We have unrealistic expectations about sex and also about romance. The Tao Te Ching is a famous Chinese book of wisdom, and the main theme of the Tao Te Ching relates to unrealistic expectations in a sense. And what it says is that if we wish to live better, it's very important that we stop trying to make life work in a way in which it won't. Again, it's very important that we stop trying to make life work in a way in which it won't. I alluded to approval seeking a little while ago. And it's interesting, when one talks about people seeking other people's approval, it's important to remember that no matter what you do in life, you will be criticized. No matter what you do, you will be criticized. If you talk too much, you'll be criticized for that. If you don't talk enough, you'll be criticized for that. And why is it that people will be criticized no matter what they do? Well, there are many reasons for this. One of the reasons is that some people are very envious. Some people indeed are vicious. And among the good people, among the decent people, I think it's fair to say that no two minds work alike, so that you'll even be criticized by decent people, perhaps by loved ones, even members of your family. So again, I think if we wish to reduce our suffering in life, perhaps again it's very important that we reduce the concern we have for what other people think of us. Another major cause of avoidable suffering, another major cause of avoidable suffering, the great thinkers tell us, is envy. Bertrand Russell, in his book entitled The Conquest of Happiness, said that envy is one of the leading causes of unhappiness. And the philosopher Spinoza said that people are naturally envious creatures, that human nature contains this ingredient of envy, so to speak. Perhaps the most insightful passage I've ever come across concerning envy is from a book entitled The Book of Jewish Wisdom, The Book of Jewish Wisdom, edited by the Newsners. It's a collection of primary source material in Judaism. And let me just quote a brief selection from the Book of Jewish Wisdom on the topic of envy. This is pretty hard-hitting. Envy fuels hatred, contempt, fear, and loathing. Envy is the single most common emotion, whether among siblings or in clubs or in businesses, offices, and professions. No single emotion brings more malice or ill will than sheer loathing of someone who has more or does more than the norm. The passage goes on to state this: envy is the price of excellence, and the one who is envied, whether proud or humble, cannot do much about it. What are some of the antidotes to envy? If it's true that envy causes so many of us unhappiness, well, what are some of the antidotes? Well, one of the antidotes to envy is the recognition that it causes us pain. In fact, Russell points out that one cannot be envious and happy at the same time. It's just impossible. Another antidote to envy is seeing more clearly. That if we are seeing more clearly, perhaps we will have gratitude for what we have instead of ingratitude for what we don't have. And of course, another antidote to envy is meaningful activity. That if you can focus your mind in a healthy way, that can be a real antidote to envy. On this subject of reducing suffering, the Dalai Lama has said this, that one of the things we must do, besides mood monitoring and thinking about our thinking, as I indicated before, the Dalai Lama says we must be tolerant of a certain amount of unhappiness in our lives. He says this, and I'm quoting the Dalai Lama: there's really no avoiding the fact that suffering is part of life. There's really no avoiding the fact that suffering is part of life. He says that we must not have an unrealistic desire for a kind of happiness that does not exist. The Tao Te Ching, the Chinese book of wisdom that I mentioned before, also provides some illumination here. The Tao Te Ching says if we wish to reduce our suffering, we should not swim against the tide. We should not cut against the grain. We should learn to go with the flow. Learn to go with the flow of life. And again, not try to force life to work in a way in which it won't. And the Tao Te Ching also emphasizes resilience. We must all cultivate resilience, the ability to recuperate from life's blows. So many of the great thinkers have also said that there are positive aspects to suffering, that there are actually lessons involved in suffering, painful lessons, obviously. Pascal, the famous French philosopher and mathematician, said this about suffering. He said, 1 hour's pain is a better teacher than all the philosophers put together. Suffering can help us to see what's important in life. Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson has said this. He said, suffering can lead us to commit more fully to our spiritual development. And Nobel Prize winner Hermann Hesse, who said that early in life he attempted suicide, but later learned how to become a more tranquil, happier person, Hesse said this. He said, whatever good or bad fortune comes our way, we can transform it into something of value, that we can learn from misfortune, and again, give it meaning and transform it into something of value. Jesus, in the Bible, also talks about possible rewards for suffering. And if one is a Christian, perhaps one will find this important. In Luke 6, Jesus says, blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. What are some of the standards, perhaps, by which we can judge emotional growth? I've talked in this program about the importance, perhaps, of achieving emotional growth. Well, how can we measure our growth? Well, I think one of the ways we can measure emotional growth is if we are experiencing more tranquil moments than we used to, if we are less nervous than we were a couple of years ago. Perhaps that is an indication we are growing emotionally. If we're better able to deal with life's difficulties, that perhaps is another standard that we can use. And also, a particular standard I like to judge one's emotional growth is this. If one isn't attempting to steal anybody else's happiness, that's a good standard. You know, so many of the great thinkers have said that one of the most common forms of stealing is stealing other people's happiness. Bertrand Russell said this. And in fact, many of the great thinkers talk about the diverse ways in which people try to steal other people's happiness. People can do it through spitefulness, through sarcasm, through bullying, through backstabbing on the job, pettiness, and small acts of sadism committed even by one's neighbors and family members on oneself. So again, I suggest to you, if one is growing emotionally, it means that one is going out of one's way not to cause other people unhappiness. And what are the standards that we might use to judge mental health? Again, this is the larger question. I've just spoken about the standards one might use to judge emotional growth. Well, again, what are some of the standards one might use to judge mental health? Well, Alfred Adler, the famous psychiatrist, said that if we have social feelings, if we have feelings for our fellow man, that's an indication that we are in good mental health. Adler also said this, and I find this quite interesting. Adler says that if a person is very ethical in his everyday dealings with other people, that's a good indication that a person is in good mental health. Again, he believed that ethics and good mental health ordinarily go together. Freud, when he was asked, what are your standards for determining one's degree of mental health? Freud said, if one can love and if one can work. Those are two pretty good indications that one is in good mental health. And the Dalai Lama, in responding to this question of what is good mental health, the Dalai Lama says that if one has a warm, kind heart, that's a good indication of mental health. In fact, let me quote you the Dalai Lama. He says, and I'm quoting him, "I would regard a compassionate, warm, kind-hearted person as healthy." In summing up now, I've suggested that among the most important things we can learn in life are to grow emotionally, and that growing emotionally involves gaining greater control over our negative emotions, and also involves cultivating our positive emotions. And that also, one of the most important learnings in life is learning how to better deal with adversity. The Stoics were philosophers of antiquity who believed that if we are going to get better at dealing with adversity, we should think of ourselves as warriors. The Stoics believe that life can often seem like a battle, and that if we consider ourselves to be warriors, perhaps that metaphor can help us to deal with life's problems. Also, the great thinkers claim that there is a kind of paradox in living a satisfying life, or a more satisfying life. And the paradox perhaps is this, that the more self-absorbed we are, the less satisfying life is. And the less self-absorbed we are, the more satisfying life is. The Dalai Lama talks about a wise selfishness. He says all of us should engage in being wisely selfish. And again, what that means, according to the Dalai Lama, is to know that in helping others, one helps oneself. Joseph Campbell provides some illumination here. Joseph Campbell, the famous professor of mythology, said this. Campbell said, "Find a place where there's joy, and the joy will burn out the pain." What I'd like to do, since we have a couple of minutes remaining, is to mention some books that you might find helpful in dealing with this topic. Perhaps you wish to explore this topic of emotional growth on your own. And the first book I would recommend, and recommend very highly, is a book entitled The Art of Happiness. The Art of Happiness, co-authored by the Dalai Lama and a psychiatrist, Howard Cutler. It's a book which is very easy to access. All of the Barnes and Noble stores I know have this book. Another book that's very helpful is one I've mentioned in a previous program. It's a very famous book in philosophy called The Apology, and it's written by Plato. And one of the most famous statements in Plato's Apology is the following. Plato says, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Among the other book recommendations, the Dhammapada. The Dhammapada is a very famous book. It's a Buddhist scripture, and it consists of collections of sayings by the Buddha. And also, another book you might wish to read is a book called The Confessions of St. Augustine. Very famous book, a classic autobiography, The Confessions of St. Augustine. And I've already mentioned the Book of Jewish Wisdom, edited by the Neusners. And in terms of reading recommendations, also I would highly recommend two essays on the subject of education, one by Montaigne and the other by Emerson. Finally, in closing, I wish to remind all of us that we are all artists. As Thoreau wrote in Walden, "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."